Milada Horakova is one of the most admirable women of our history. She was highly intelligent and ambitious, guided by her strong moral principles and high conscientiousness. It is her relentless drive towards advocacy of humanity, justice, freedom, and democracy, and her unwillingness to compromise on her principles that led to her tragic ending and undying legacy. Milada was born on Christmas Day in 1901 in Prague, a city in the Austria-Hungary Empire. Her first life-shaping experience came at the age of 13 when she lost both of her siblings to scarlet fever. And this painful experience led her to recognize the importance of proactive approach against human suffering. She realized she could not behave passively and that apathy could not and must not dictate her actions. Her father was an anti-monarchist and sympathized with the teachings of Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, who would later become the first president of democratic Czechoslovakia. His thinking also had a significant impact on Milada, who was a teenager during World War I. And because of her strong beliefs in democratic ideals, Milada joined the anti-royal manifestations in 1918, which led her to be expelled from high school and forced to graduate elsewhere. Following advice from her father, she went on to study law at Charles University in Prague, where she met Františka Plamínkova, the founder of the women's movement and her future mentor. It didn't take long before Milada entered the leadership of the organization and became the head of women's legal rights. 1925 was a tough year for Milada, who was finishing her law degree while also fighting the deadly scarlet fever, whom both of her siblings succumbed to a decade earlier. She was too strong to give in to the disease and managed to graduate with first class the same year. Right after she obtained her degree, she married Bohuslav Horák, the love of her life. Bohuslav was an agricultural engineer and editor of the Czechoslovak broadcasting station. Their shared belief in the ideals of humanity, truth, freedom, and justice made their bond unbreakable. The 1930s were arguably the happiest times of their lives. Their careers were on the rise. Their daughter, Jana, was born, who lives in America today, by the way, and Milada's work in equalizing women in the workplace started to be recognized internationally. Milada considered herself a social worker first and foremost, and work in the area of social care was her priority. She was part of Red Cross and many other organizations advancing human rights. In the late 30s, she was one of the few people who suspected Hitler's rise and his imperialist ambitions. She warned Roosevelt, Chamberlain, and Churchill and other world leaders against Hitler, but her wishes remained unfulfilled. After the Munich Treaty in 1938, where Czechoslovakia had to give up part of its land called Sudeten to Germany, Milada, as usual, was in the field helping resettle Czech refugees from the confiscated Sudetenland. After the Munich Treaty, Milada joined the anti-fascist resistance movement PVVZ, which was helping collect German intelligence. And this is what got her and her husband arrested by Gestapo in 1940. Gestapo used cruel interrogation techniques on Milada, as confirmed by one of her fellow prisoners, but she never succumbed and gave them no information whatsoever. During World War II, she went through various prisons, labor camps, transportation camps, and in 1944 she received a death sentence in a trial in Germany. But because of her husband's clever diplomacy with the Germans, her sentence was reduced to 8 years before she was liberated by the Americans in 1945. While in Terezín concentration camp during the war, she reunited with Františka Plamínkova, remember her mentor and close collaborator, who was sadly shot by the Germans in 1942. And this affected Milada greatly, but made her even more committed to fight for freedom and democracy. It's interesting to note that her cell in Terezín, that I had visited many times because my grandparents live in the city, had been previously occupied by Gavril Princip, who assassinated Franz Ferdinand and started World War I. Is this a coincidence? Their destinies sort of came together, two people who fought for freedom of their country and who paid the highest price. After her return home in 1945, one would expect that Milada would be exhausted and ready to settle down or emigrate abroad, as she had received many offers from her colleagues in Britain, France, and America. She refused and said that she had never been more motivated to fight for freedom in her dear homeland. She returns to work literally a day after her return from prison. She was in bad health, she had bruises all over her body was malnourished and decimated. Her mind must have been heavily affected by the events of the war, but she had an incredible work ethic and commitment to her mission. She rejoined the Czechoslovak National Social Party and became a member of the Provisional National Assembly, which was supposed to prepare the country for the 1946 democratic elections. In those elections, Milada was elected into the Constituent National Assembly and became a key figure in foreign policy, among other things. Communists, however, had the upper hand, as they were the leading party in the assembly. And you may ask, how come? How did communists democratically win the 1946 elections? And at the time, people thought communism was this great new ideology that was going to transform society for the better. And remember, Czechoslovakia was liberated by the Red Army, so people naturally trusted them. Plus, most right parties were banned from running for elections in 46. However, Milada was never fooled by the communists and pushed hard for Czechoslovakia to accept the Marshall Plan, a plan to rebuild Europe through financial aid from the United States. She failed to convince the communists, who were closely allied with the Soviet Union. Communists recognized her pro-Western tendencies and started closely monitoring her. In her 2 years in the assembly, from 46 to 48, she was working on writing a new Czechoslovak constitution, reflecting democratic ideals set by first President Tomáš Masaryk. She renewed Women's National Council and traveled internationally to represent women's rights and advocate for peace. She also traveled extensively in the district that she represented to warn people against the communists and make sure they don't win the 1948 elections, because that could mean an end to democracy. Sadly, no elections happened. Instead, a crisis hit in February 1948. Milada was trying to unite the parliament to discuss the government crisis, but did not succeed. The communists overthrew the government, ousted everyone who was not loyal to the party and the Soviet Union, and killed the ones who resisted. Milada, who would of course never compromise on her principles, was forced to resign, and the next day she was also fired from the women's movement and replaced by a communist, of course. Once again, her foreign friends asked her to emigrate abroad, as they knew as much as she did that her life was in danger, and she could have been thrown out of the window any day, like the foreign minister Jan Masaryk. She refused. Czechoslovakia was like her dear child, and what parent on earth could possibly abandon their child? She could not do that. After several calls from friends to lay low and completely leave politics, Milada again could not stay passive and watch democracy crumble, and so in May 1948, she founded an informal group which was meant to maintain connections with exiled politicians in the West. Slowly she was building anti-communist resistance. She was already on the communists' radar, and in September 1949 she was arrested. Her husband managed to flee to Germany and planned to reconnect with exiled politicians to help Milada escape as well. She was certain that they would either come arrest her or that she would be killed. So why, after so many warnings from her family and friends, so many failures and arrests and prison sentences, why would she not give up? Why did she stay? Why did she endanger the lives of her family? Her failure was almost guaranteed. Even her husband wanted her to emigrate. But Milada, the strong, the resilient, the hopeful Milada, decided to fight till the end. She could not possibly live with herself if she had abandoned her dear country and let it succumb to a totalitarian regime. In one of her last letters to her daughter, she said, "All Czechoslovak children are my children. I can't leave them to the devil, my dear child. Perhaps you will forgive me one day." Milada became one of many victims in the show trials of the communists that date back to the 30s and the Stalinist era. She was accused of leading a conspiracy to commit treason and espionage at the behest of the United States, Great Britain, France, and Yugoslavia. One more time, she was given a chance to go and leave the country and live happily ever after. But that would require her to plead guilty to committing treason. And Milada, as we know her, could not compromise on her principles and could not commit to this lie. The communists used physical and psychological torture to make her plead guilty. Can you imagine the pressure she was under? But she did not succumb. Communists had to move on to Plan B, set up a fake political trial where she would be sentenced to death. But because of her good standing and popularity amongst the public, the communists had to tarnish her reputation first, before creating this fake political trial. So they had to get the public on board. So they started publishing fake stories about her supposed involvement with the fascists during World War II. Completely, utterly false, of course. What's surprising to me is that people started believing it very quickly. Only 4 years after the end of World War II and after her release from German prison, people somehow had a very short memory. Her political process started in May 1950 and was carefully scripted. 12 other people were supposed to be sentenced to death. Milada was the only woman in the trial. That was public and broadcasted on radio and TV. And Milada was, of course, forced to memorize the script, which the public obviously didn't know about. Once again, Milada broke the rules, and in her last defense, managed to refer to Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk and Edvard Beneš, two of the role models in her life, and managed to defend the ideals of freedom, truth, love, humanity, and justice, knowing that moving from the official script would surely give her a death sentence. Lying just wasn't something she could do. After the court sentenced her to death, several prominent figures, including Albert Einstein, Winston Churchill, Eleanor Roosevelt, asked for her pardon, but the communists did not weaken their stance. In her last letter to her family, the morning of her murder, she wrote, "I am leaving with my head upright. One has to be able to lose. There is no shame in losing. Even an enemy will not fail to be respected if he is truthful and honest. People fall in fights, and what is life other than a fight?" Milada was hanged on 27th of June, 1950. She died by suffocating after 15 minutes, having witnessed the murder of her 5 colleagues who were hanged before her. Her remains were never found, and she only received her final resting place after the fall of the regime. Her last words were, I fall, I lost this fight. I'm leaving in dignity. I love this land, I love the people. Please build a prosperous society. I am leaving without hatred towards you. I wish you well, I wish you well. Even in her last moments, she remained loyal to her ideals of freedom, truth, humanity, justice, and love. Her sister described her as an ordinary, rational woman. I disagree. I believe Milada was an extraordinary woman in extraordinary circumstances, who reminds us every day that our discomfort is nothing compared to hers, that our democracy doesn't last if we don't want it to last, that freedoms are not guaranteed and we have to proactively work to maintain them, and that hope, as Václav Havel says, is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of the outcome. I'm hopeful that we can unite and commit to the ideals of democracy and freedom. Thank you.